The dog was dying on the floor of the emergency bay, and Nurse Harlow Beckett, no, not that name. Let me start over in my head and come out clean on the page. The dog came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in November, draped across the arms of a soldier who looked like he hadn't slept in 4 days. Nurse Tyne Mallory was charting at the station when the doors blew open, not slid, blew, like something had hit them from the outside, and she looked up to see a man in full tactical gear, desert dust still on his boots, carrying a German shepherd with a military vest soaked through with dark blood. The dog's head hung loose. One rear leg was wrapped in a field dressing that had long since stopped doing its job. "He needs help," the soldier said. His voice didn't shake. That was somehow the worst part. Tyne was on her feet before she'd made any conscious decision to stand. The dog, she'd learned his name was Juno and that he'd been working with the 75th Ranger Regiment for 3 years, had taken shrapnel from an IED that shouldn't have been where it was. The handler, Sergeant Harmon, had packed the wound himself in the field using materials from a kit that was already 2 supplies short. They'd been 40 minutes from the nearest veterinary facility and 12 minutes from Callaway Regional, and Sergeant Harmon had made a choice. "He's not a patient here," said the charge nurse, Denise Pratt, appearing from the hallway behind Tyne with a clipboard tucked under one arm and the particular expression of someone who had already decided how this conversation was going to end. "I know that," Tyne said. She was already pulling on gloves. "Tyne." The way Pratt said her name had a period at the end of it. "He's bleeding internally. Look at his gum color. He's in shock. This is a human hospital. I can see that." Sergeant Harmon hadn't moved. He was still standing just inside the doors, holding Juno against his chest, and his eyes had the distant, fixed quality of a man who had learned not to show anything in public and was currently failing at it very quietly. There was a smear of dried blood along his jaw that wasn't his. Tyne had done 2 years of pre-vet before switching to nursing. She knew enough. She also knew that if she stopped to think about whether she was allowed to know enough, she was going to hesitate, and hesitation had a cost that Juno couldn't afford right now. "Bring him back," she said to Harmon. "Bay 3. Now." Pratt stepped in front of her. "You cannot treat an animal in this facility. It's against policy. It's a liability issue, and administration will." "Administration isn't here at midnight," Tyne said. "I am." She went around her. What followed was 40 minutes that Tyne would later describe to the people who asked as the most focused she had ever been in her life. Bay 3 had what she needed. Not everything, not even close, but enough. She irrigated the wound. She controlled the bleeding. She placed a line and pushed fluids carefully, watching Juno's breathing, watching his eyes, talking to him the whole time in the low, even voice she used, with patients who were frightened and couldn't tell her where it hurt. Sergeant Harmon stood at the edge of the bay with his arms at his sides. He didn't interfere. He didn't ask questions. At one point, when Juno's breathing steadied and the dog's tail moved, just once, just a fraction, Tyne heard the soldier exhale like he'd been holding that breath since the IED went off. She was finishing her documentation when hospital's administrator Len Crowell walked in. He was a tall man in his late 50s who always seemed to be wearing a suit that was slightly too well pressed for whatever was actually happening around him. He'd been called in, presumably by Pratt, and he arrived with the energy of someone who had prepared a statement on the drive over. "Miss Mallory." He didn't look at Juno. He didn't look at Harmon. "My office. Now, I need to finish this note. Now, please." She finished the note. Then she followed him. The conversation in his office lasted 9 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock on the wall behind his head, the one with the second hand that jumped instead of swept, and she counted the jumps because it gave her something to do with the part of her brain that wasn't listening to Len Crowell, explain to her about protocols and liability exposure, and the importance of institutional boundaries, and then inform her, in the tone of a man who believed he was being very reasonable, that her employment at Callaway Regional was terminated effective immediately. "Tonight?" she said. "I'm afraid so. Security will escort you out. My patients will be transferred to the next shift, which is coming on in 40 minutes. He folded his hands on the desk. "I'm sorry, Tyne. I understand you were trying to help, but you've put this hospital in a very difficult position." She thought about Juno's gum color when Harmon had carried him in, white as copy paper, slick with shock. She thought about the moment the dog's tail moved. She didn't say any of those things because she understood, looking at Crowell's carefully arranged expression, that they would not land anywhere useful. "Can I get my things from my locker?" she said. "Security will accompany you." She had a spare pair of shoes, a water bottle, a photograph of her sister's kids taped to the inside of the door, a travel-size bottle of lotion, and a paperback she'd been working through for 3 weeks. She put all of it in a plastic bag that one of the security guards found for her without being asked. He didn't say anything either. He just handed her the bag and looked at the floor. Her jacket was in the break room. They let her get that too. Her car keys were in her jacket pocket, which was lucky, because she was outside in the parking lot in the November cold before she thought to check. And for a moment, just a moment, she stood beside her car in the dark and had no idea what to do with herself. She'd left a half-eaten granola bar in Bay 3. She'd left her phone charger plugged in at the station. She'd been in the middle of charting a patient's overnight vitals when the doors blew open. She sat in her car. She didn't drive anywhere yet. The hospital entrance was lit up behind her, that particular after-midnight glow that she associated with the beginning of shifts rather than the end of them. And she sat there in the cold with the heat running and thought about Juno's breathing, and whether whoever came on at midnight would know to check on him, and whether Sergeant Harmon had eaten anything since whatever country he'd last been standing in. She drove home. She did not sleep. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, sitting in her car in the parking lot, was that Sergeant Dex Harmon had watched her leave. He'd been in the hallway, back against the wall, in the way that people who've spent time in the military learn to position themselves. Sight lines clear, exit visible. When Crowell's assistant had come to tell him that Ms. Mallory had been let go and that his dog would need to be transferred to a veterinary facility at his earliest convenience. The assistant had said it politely, the way people say things when they're delivering someone else's message and don't particularly agree with it. Harmon had nodded. He'd looked down at Juno, who was lying on the bay table with an IV line in and his breathing steady, and he'd done the math. Juno was certified with the Department of Defense. He had a service record. He had a handler, Harmon, and a unit, and a commanding officer, and that commanding officer was Colonel Adria Vance, currently stationed at Fort Maddox, 40 miles north. Harmon had Colonel Vance's direct number for emergencies. He used it. He told her what happened, the IED, the wound, the 12-minute drive to Callaway Regional, Nurse Mallory, the wound irrigation, the steady breathing. Then he told her about the administrator and the escort and the plastic bag. There was a pause on the other end of the line. She was terminated, Vance said. Tonight, while the dog was still in the building. Another pause. Then, get some sleep, Sergeant. Keep me updated on Juno. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. He'd made the call because it felt like the right thing to do, and because Juno was alive and someone had made that happen and then been walked out into a parking lot in November for it, and that sequence of events sat wrong with him in a way he didn't have language for yet. He slept in the chair next to Juno's bay. Nobody asked him to leave. Tyne spent Friday doing the things you do when a job you've had for 4 years disappears overnight. She called her sister, who said, "Oh my God," several times, and asked if Tyne wanted her to come over. Tyne said no. She made coffee. She looked at her bank account and did the calculation that everybody does when something like this happens. How many months? How much room? What flexibility looks like from here? She was not a person who cried easily. She was aware of this about herself. She'd gotten it from her father, who was a quiet man with practical hands, who had taught her, without ever saying so directly, that feelings were an emotion and not emergencies. She felt the grief of it. Of course she did, but she felt it the way she felt most hard things, at a slight remove, like she was watching herself feel it and taking notes. She thought about calling a lawyer. She thought about what she would say. I treated a military working dog who was dying, and I was fired for it. She tried to hear how that would sound. She thought it would sound true, but she also thought truth had a complicated relationship with outcomes. She didn't call anyone. She made a second cup of coffee and sat with it at the kitchen table and watched the light change on the far wall through the afternoon. Her phone rang at 4:18 p.m. unknown number. Tyne Mallory? Yes, this is Colonel Adria Vance, Fort Maddox. Do you have a few minutes? Colonel Vance had a voice that was precise without being cold. The voice of someone who had spent a long time making decisions quickly and had gotten good at sounding certain even in the middle of uncertainty. She asked Tyne several questions, all of them direct, none of them rhetorical. She confirmed the timeline. She asked about Juno's condition at the time of arrival, about the interventions Tyne had used, about the conversation with Crowell. Tyne answered everything as accurately as she could. She did not editorialize. She did not say it was wrong, or he shouldn't have done that, or I was just trying to help, because those were the kinds of things that sounded like arguments. And she didn't have the sense that Colonel Vance needed arguments. She seemed to be building something, and Tyne's job in this conversation was to give her the materials. "One more question," Vance said, "and this is just for my own information. When you made the decision to treat Juno, in that moment, what were you thinking?" Tyne considered this. "That his gum color was bad," she said, "and that I knew what to do about it." A beat of silence, then, "Thank you, Ms. Mallory. We'll be in touch." Saturday morning, Tyne got a call from her former colleague, a night shift nurse named Phil Strand, who had a habit of texting when he should sleep and who was, among his many other qualities, genuinely terrible at keeping news to himself. "You are not going to believe what's happening at this hospital right now," he texted. Then, 45 seconds later, "Calling you." He called her. He was whispering, which Phil Strand almost never did. "There are military people here," he said. "Like a lot of military people. In dress uniform. And there's a woman, Tyne. She has eagles on her collar. I looked it up, that's a colonel. And she's in Crowell's office, and apparently has been for an hour. And there's also a JAG officer." Someone said, "JAG." "And Pratt is sitting outside the office, and she looks—" He paused, apparently to find the right word. "She looks like someone who has realized that a decision she made is going to be examined very carefully by people with authority to examine it." Tyne sat with this for a moment. "How's Juno?" she said. "The dog? Actually, that's the other thing. He's still here. They didn't move him. And there's a ranger sergeant who hasn't left his side since Thursday night." She already knew that would be Harmon. She didn't go to the hospital that day. It wasn't her hospital anymore, and she had the sense that whatever was happening there was happening without needing her present for it. She went for a long walk instead, the kind she took when she needed to think in a direction rather than in circles. The November light was thin and specific, the kind that made everything look a little more itself than usual. She thought about Juno. She thought about the way his tail had moved. That single, small flag of acknowledgement when his breathing had steadied. She thought about Sergeant Harmon's face when she'd said, "Bring him back, Bay 3, now," and the way he'd moved without hesitation, the way people move when someone has just said the thing they most needed to hear. She thought about her father, who used to say that the worst thing about doing the right thing was that it didn't always come with a receipt. You did it, and then you lived with it, and sometimes that was enough, and sometimes it wasn't, and you mostly had no control over which kind of situation you were in. She thought he was probably right. She thought he was also wrong, in the way that true things can sometimes be technically accurate and still incomplete. Her phone buzzed. Phil again. A photograph this time, taken covertly from what appeared to be a supply closet vantage point, slightly blurry, showing the main corridor outside the administrator's wing. There were 3 people in dress uniform walking in the same direction. Beside them, in civilian clothes, was a man with a briefcase who had attorney in his posture, the same way Harmon had soldier in his. Then another message. "Crowell has been in there for 2 hours. Someone said he's been asked to provide documentation of every decision made Thursday night." Then Pratt too. Then, a full minute later. "They're saying the hospital's DO'd contract is under review." Tyne put her phone in her pocket. She finished her walk. When she got home, she made dinner, actually made it, from scratch, the kind of task that required just enough attention to give the rest of her mind somewhere to settle. She was washing dishes when her phone rang again. "Colonel Vance, Ms. Mallory, I wanted to update you personally." There was something different in her voice now, not warmer exactly, but more direct. Like a door opened a crack. "As of this afternoon, Mr. Crowell has been informed that his termination decision regarding your employment is under review by the hospital board, in coordination with our legal team. That review has been expedited." "Okay," Tyne said. We've also made the hospital aware that Corporal Juno's treatment record will be included in our assessment of Callaway Regional's eligibility for continued Department of Defense partnership contracts. Tyne processed this. He's a corporal, she said. He outranks his handler. There was a measured pause that might have been, in a different context, something close to dry humor. Sergeant Harmon finds this funnier than it actually is. How is Juno? She asked. She hadn't meant to ask it quite that plainly, but there it was. Stable. He'll need another 10 days of recovery, but the wound care was good. The vet we brought in said whoever handled the initial intervention knew what they were doing. A beat. I told her you'd take that as the highest possible compliment. The board meeting happened on Monday. Tyne was not in the room, but she had a lawyer now. Her sister had made the call that Tyne hadn't, and the lawyer had taken the case with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had spotted what they considered to be a very clean set of facts. She got a call at 2 p.m. reinstatement, effective immediately. Full back pay for the days missed. And Crowell, the lawyer, delivered this piece of information with a care that suggested he understood it would land somewhere, had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review of his decision-making process. Denise Pratt had submitted a written apology. Whether she had meant it or whether she had simply understood that it was what the situation required, Tyne didn't try to determine. She accepted it with the same practical clarity she'd tried to apply to everything else. She went back to work on Tuesday. Her locker still had the photograph of her sister's kids on the inside of the door. Someone, she didn't know who, had taped it back up after she'd left. The travel-size lotion was still there. The paperback was on the break room table with a post-it note on it that said, "We held on to this for you," in Phil Strand's handwriting. She found Sergeant Harmon in the hallway outside Bay 3 at the end of her first shift back. He was in civilian clothes this time, jeans, a plain jacket, and he looked like he'd slept, finally, like the weight of the last 4 days had shifted somewhere he could carry it better. Juno was beside him on a lead, moving carefully, one rear leg wrapped in a clean professional dressing. He was alert. His ears were up. When he saw Tyne, his tail moved, not once this time, steadily. Harmon watched this and then looked at her with the same direct, unornamented expression he'd had when he walked through the doors 10 days ago. "He remembers you," he said. Tyne crouched down. She let Juno come to her on his own terms, which he did, pressing his nose briefly against her palm with the particular deliberateness of an animal that has learned not to give trust quickly. "Hey, Juno," she said quietly. She stayed there for a moment, the hallway loud around them. The shift change starting up, someone 3 bays down calling for a chart, and she thought about her father and receipts, and whether he'd been right, and whether she'd gotten one anyway, and what it felt like if you had. It felt like this, she decided. Not loud, not triumphant. Just a dog's nose against your hand and the knowledge that you had done the thing that was yours to do and that it had been enough. She stood up. She had 4 patients waiting. She went back to work.